$381 million. That's how much was illegally built on my grandfather's land. While this HOA president pocketed every cent of rent for 15 straight years. 847 massive homes on 1,300 acres that have belonged to my family since 1952. Then one day, she struts up in her designer heels and spits, "Get that trashy truck off my mountain before I call the cops on you, white trash." She had no idea she was standing on land I now own, including the house she lives in. My grandfather died thinking we lost everything. She lived like a queen off our money. But when I found that old 1952 contract in his safe, one hidden clause changed everything. This is the sweetest revenge on a greedy Karen who's about to lose it all. What would you do? Comment below where you're watching from, and if you've ever dreamed of destroying someone untouchable like this. Let me back up and tell you how this whole mess started. 3 days after my grandfather Ezra passed away, I maxed out my credit card to drive 12 hours from Ohio to settle his estate. I'm a mechanic, calloused hands, oil under my fingernails, behind on rent for 3 months. Figured I'd inherit his old cabin, sell it quick to pay for his funeral, and maybe keep the lights on another month. My family had been broke for as long as I could remember. Dad always said Grandpa made poor choices with money. We'd grown up hearing stories about how he'd wasted the family fortune on worthless mountain land, instead of investing in something practical. The smell of pine sap and old leather hit me when I walked into that cabin. Dust particles danced in afternoon sunlight streaming through windows he probably hadn't cleaned in 20 years. Everything felt frozen in time. His coffee mug still on the kitchen table, reading glasses folded next to hand-drawn surveyor maps from the 1940s. See, Grandpa Ezra was the original surveyor for this area, but 1,300 acres of pure Colorado wilderness for $3,200 in 1952, when it was nothing but pine trees and elk trails. The family always joked he got the worthless land, while smart investors bought downtown plots. Every family gathering ended with someone mentioning Ezra's big mistake. Turns out the joke was on all of us. I was sorting through his papers, old receipts, faded photographs, engineering notes in his careful handwriting, when I heard the crunch of gravel outside. Then came the click, click, click of designer heels marching up my driveway like a metronome of pure entitlement. "Excuse me, sir." The voice had this ridiculous fake British accent that screamed, "I watch too much Downton Abbey." "I'm Brenda Kensington Walsh, president of the Pinnacle Ridge Homeowners Association." I looked up to see a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair, oversized sunglasses, and an $80,000 Range Rover that probably cost more than I'd make in 3 years. She'd clearly moved here from California within the last few years. Everything about her screamed, "I'm better than you mountain people." "Ma'am," I nodded, stepping onto the porch. The autumn leaves crunched under my work boots. "This community has standards," she announced, scratching her acrylic nails against a clipboard loaded with official-looking forms. "That eyesore truck needs removal immediately. We simply cannot have 847 homeowners' property values affected by this situation. 847 families. I filed that number away for later. My husband Dennis works for the county assessor's office," she added with a smug smile that made my skin crawl. "We know exactly what this property is assessed at, which frankly isn't much compared to our community standards." What she didn't know, what nobody in this whole damn neighborhood knew, was that every single one of those pristine McMansions was sitting on land my family had owned since 1952. The property management company had been collecting over $12,000 monthly in lease payments that should have been coming to us for the past 15 years. While my grandfather died believing we'd lost everything, this woman was living like royalty off our inheritance. And here's the kicker I was starting to realize. If those lease payments had been stolen, and if I could prove ownership, I could charge whatever rent I wanted. Market rate for prime mountain property? About triple what these people were currently paying. But I didn't say any of that. Not yet. "I'll handle the truck situation," I said simply, watching her scribble violation notices with those ridiculous nails. She handed me an official-looking paper with the HOA seal. "You have 72 hours to comply, or face $500 in daily fines. Welcome to Pinnacle Ridge, Mr. Brennan. Cole Brennan. Well, Mr. Brennan, I do hope you'll fit in better than your grandfather did." As her Range Rover purred away down the mountain road, I stood there holding that violation notice, listening to the wind whistle through the pines. I thought about those 847 families, about 15 years of stolen payments, about what they'd say when they found out who really owned their mountain paradise. Time to find Grandpa's hidden safe and see what secrets he'd been keeping. The next morning, I woke up to flashing red and blue lights outside my window. 2 sheriff's deputies stood on my porch at 6 a.m., looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Behind them, Brenda sat in her Range Rover with a satisfied smirk, cell phone pressed to her ear, like she was commanding a military operation from her luxury bunker. "Mr. Brennan, we have a restraining order here. Ma'am says you threatened her yesterday." I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, tasting the metallic bitterness of adrenaline. I told her I'd handled the truck situation. That's threatening? The older deputy, his name tag read Martinez, looked embarrassed. "Sir, she's also filed a complaint claiming you don't have legal right to be on this property. Says there's some kind of ownership dispute." "Officers, I inherited this place 3 days ago. I've got the death certificate and deed paperwork inside." Deputy Martinez nodded. "That'd be helpful, sir." Mrs. Walsh also mentioned something about back taxes. Her husband Dennis works for the county assessor's office. Says he knows the real situation here. That's when the first piece clicked. Dennis Walsh, county assessor. No wonder this scam had run so smoothly for 15 years. After the deputies left, I drove into town with the smell of pine needles and morning frost sharp in my nostrils. The Pine Ridge Public Library sat on Main Street like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting, complete with hand-painted signs that probably violated 6 HOA rules in Brenda's perfect world. Inside, I met Mrs. Opal Cartwright, the librarian who'd apparently been there since the Eisenhower administration. She had silver hair, kind eyes behind thick glasses, and moved between the stacks with the quiet confidence of someone who knew where every secret was buried. "You're Ezra's grandson," she said before I even introduced herself. "Heard about the trouble with that Kensington Walsh woman. Your grandfather was a good man. That woman made his last years hell, always threatening lawsuits over some imaginary covenant violation." The musty scent of old paper filled my lungs as Mrs. Opal led me to the county records section. What we found in those yellowed file folders made my hands shake with anger. Starting in 2005, the assessed value of my grandfather's land had been mysteriously lowered from $2.8 million to just $180,000. Every year, Dennis Walsh had signed off on keeping it artificially undervalued. I remembered my father mentioning something years ago about property taxes being surprisingly manageable on the mountain land. Now I knew why. "This is fraud," Mrs. Opal whispered, running her finger down the assessment records. "Plain and simple." My lawyer father had always told me that when property taxes are based on fraudulent assessments, it can void any squatter's rights claims. Suddenly, that advice made perfect sense. If Brenda tried claiming she owned this land through long-term occupation, these fake tax records would destroy her case in court. The rough texture of decades-old property deeds felt like evidence under my fingertips. Each document told the same story, systematic manipulation going back to when the Walshes first got involved. By noon, I'd called Janet Torres, a property attorney in Denver, who specialized in land disputes. Her voice carried the sharp confidence of someone who'd seen every trick in the book. "Mr. Brennan, you need to file what's called a quiet title lawsuit immediately. It forces everyone to prove their ownership claims in court with real documentation. Given what you've described, we have grounds to challenge every property transfer in that subdivision." While I was building my legal case, Brenda was busy with her own warfare. She'd created a Facebook group called Protect Pinnacle Ridge from Undesirable Elements, where she posted Ring doorbell footage of me performing highly suspicious activities, like checking my mailbox and walking to my truck. The comments section read like a paranoid neighborhood watch meeting, with neighbors debating whether I was a drifter or just not our kind of people. Honestly, watching suburban moms analyze my morning routine like I was some kind of criminal mastermind was better entertainment than cable TV. The sound of my phone buzzing interrupted my research. Sheriff Martinez, who I'd learned was Brenda's brother-in-law, had started scheduling wellness checks on me twice daily. Nothing says innocent homeowner quite like turning law enforcement into your personal harassment squad. But Brenda had made one crucial mistake. While she was playing Facebook warrior and pulling family strings, she'd revealed the scope of their operation. Dennis's involvement meant this wasn't just stolen rent money. This was systematic document fraud involving county officials. I could smell the approaching storm in the crisp mountain air as I sat in my truck outside the library. The engine ticked as it cooled, and I realized I wasn't just fighting an entitled HOA president anymore. I was about to take on an entire network of corruption that had been stealing from my family for 15 years. Mrs. Opal tapped on my window, holding a manila folder thick with photocopied documents. "Take these, honey," she said. "Your grandfather would want you to have ammunition for this fight." Time to see just how deep this rabbit hole went, and whether the Walsh family was ready for a real war. 3 days later, Brenda called an emergency HOA meeting. I wasn't invited, of course, but Mrs. Opal had friends everywhere. According to her source, Margaret Flynn, a retired teacher who lived 2 streets over, Brenda had worked herself into a complete frenzy trying to rally the neighborhood against me. She kept pacing back and forth like a caged animal, Margaret told me over coffee at the local diner, talking about undesirable elements and protecting our investment. Then she called for an official vote, declaring your cabin a public nuisance. The smell of bacon grease and fresh coffee filled the small restaurant as Margaret described the meeting. Only 12 homeowners had shown up out of 847, but Brenda declared it a mandate from the community anyway. Apparently, basic math wasn't a requirement for HOA leadership. "Here's the real kicker," Margaret continued, lowering her voice. She announced a new monthly security fee, $200 per household, to hire private patrol guards. Said it was necessary because of recent security threats. I nearly choked on my coffee. $200 times 847 homes meant another $169,400 monthly flowing straight into Brenda's bank account, disguised as community safety. At this rate, she'd be charging homeowners for the privilege of breathing mountain air. That afternoon, I decided to take a walk around my property lines with the trail cameras I'd ordered online. Perfectly legal to install on your own land, and given recent events, probably necessary. As I mounted the first camera near the eastern boundary, I heard the rumble of a dump truck approaching through the trees. The sound of diesel exhaust and grinding gears echoed off the mountainside. Dennis Walsh was behind the wheel, backing up to dump a load of construction debris right onto my property. Broken concrete, rusty rebar, and what looked like old roofing materials scattered across the forest floor, with a crash that sent birds fleeing from nearby trees. I stayed hidden behind a cluster of aspens, letting my new camera capture everything. The sound of hydraulic pistons groaned as the truck bed lifted, spilling more trash across the meadow where my grandfather used to watch elk graze. When Dennis finished and drove away, I walked through the mess he'd left behind. The acrid smell of old tar and concrete dust burned my nostrils. This wasn't just illegal dumping. It was a calculated attempt to contaminate my land and justify some kind of environmental cleanup seizure. But I had bigger concerns when I got back to the cabin. Buck Martinez was waiting on my porch. Buck owned the hardware store in town, a weathered man in his 50s with calloused hands and the steady demeanor that comes from decades of honest work. He'd been watching me install security equipment all week, and finally decided to speak up. "Son, you need to know what that woman's been doing to local businesses," he said, settling into one of grandfather's old porch chairs. "She's been making donation requests from every shop on Main Street, claims the HOA board voted to support local commerce, but anyone who doesn't pay up suddenly gets mysterious building code violations." The pieces were clicking into place. Brenda wasn't just stealing from homeowners. She was running a full-scale protection racket throughout the entire town. "Last month, she hit up my store for $500, Buck continued. "When I refused, suddenly the county inspector found safety violations in my electrical system. Cost me $3,000 to fix problems that magically appeared after Dennis Walsh's office got involved." That's when I remembered something my uncle had drilled into me during his brief stint as a real estate agent. Property owners control easements, the legal rights that allow people to cross their land to reach other properties. Years ago, he'd told me about a case where a rancher had legally blocked access to an entire subdivision just by closing his private road. "Buck, how many of these houses use the main mountain road to access their properties?" His eyes lit up with understanding. "Son, that road cuts right through the heart of your grandfather's original property. Every single house in Pinnacle Ridge depends on it to get in and out." That evening, I spread grandfather's surveyor maps across the kitchen table, tracing the original 1952 boundaries with my finger. The main access road, the one Brenda's Range Rover used twice daily, the one that connected all 847 homes to civilization, ran directly across land that had belonged to my family for 70 years. The rough paper felt like raw power under my hands as I realized what this meant. I didn't just own the land under their houses. I controlled their only escape route. My phone rang before I could fully process this discovery. Janet Torres, my attorney, had urgent news. "Cole, Brenda just escalated to federal level. She filed a complaint claiming your property contains protected wetlands, requiring immediate government oversight. If the EPA buys her story, they could seize everything through eminent domain." The taste of rage filled my mouth as I stared out at the pristine mountain meadows my grandfather had protected for decades. Brenda was pulling out every weapon in her arsenal, bringing in federal agencies to steal what local corruption couldn't touch. But she just made her biggest mistake. Because now I knew exactly how to cut off her entire kingdom with one simple legal move. Time to stop playing defense and start choking off her escape routes. The next morning, Brenda made her boldest move yet. She showed up at my door with a manila folder and what looked like expensive legal counsel, a man in a $1,000 suit who introduced himself as Mr. Whitmore from the Denver firm of Whitmore, Sterling and Associates. "Mr. Brennan," Brenda announced, her fake British accent thicker than usual, "we've come to resolve this unfortunate misunderstanding once and for all." The smell of her overpowering perfume, something that probably cost more than my monthly rent, mixed with the crisp mountain air as she handed me a document. "This is the original 1955 land agreement between your grandfather and the previous HOA president, Harold Kensington. It clearly states that Ezra Brennan sold all development rights to the Pinnacle Ridge Community Association in perpetuity." I studied the yellowed paper, noting the official-looking stamps and carefully aged appearance. At first glance, it seemed legitimate, until my mechanic's eye for detail caught something that made my bullshit detector start screaming. "This is interesting," I said slowly. "My grandfather's signature looks remarkably similar to his 1970s handwriting style, not his 1950s penmanship." Whitmore cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Brennan, document analysis can be tricky for lay people. This agreement has been properly authenticated." "By who? And why does this 1955 document mention zip codes when they weren't invented until 1963? The look that passed between Brenda and her fancy lawyer was worth every penny of his probably outrageous hourly fee. Apparently, Google wasn't part of their forgery research process. That afternoon, I drove the document straight to Janet Torres's office in Denver. She took one look at it and started laughing so hard she nearly spilled coffee on her desk. "Cole, this is the most amateurish forgery I've seen in 20 years of practice. Wrong paper stock for the 1950s, modern ballpoint pen ink, and whoever did this clearly failed basic American history." But Janet's expression grew deadly serious as she continued examining the document. "However, this level of sophistication suggests they've done this before. I'm calling my contact at the FBI White-Collar Crime Unit immediately." Within 48 hours, Special Agent Sarah Kim was sitting in my cabin, reviewing copies of every document Brenda had produced. The sound of her fingers tapping against her laptop keyboard filled the room as she cross-referenced the case with federal databases. "Mr. Brennan, we've been tracking a pattern of real estate fraud across 3 Colorado counties. Your Mrs. Kensington Walsh matches the profile of someone we've been investigating under multiple aliases." The mini twist hit like a sledgehammer to the gut. Multiple aliases? 5 years ago, she was Brenda Simpson in Grand Junction, running an identical scam against elderly landowners. Before that, Brenda Morrison in Durango. Always the same pattern: forge historical documents, manipulate county records, steal lease payments from vulnerable families. Agent Kim pulled out a thick file folder that made my grandfather's record-keeping look amateur. Here's what's interesting about federal mail fraud. The moment someone mails falsified documents across state lines, it becomes our jurisdiction, not some local sheriff's problem. I remembered my father explaining this concept during one of his rare legal conversations. Mail fraud becomes a federal crime when it crosses state boundaries, and the penalties are severe, up to 20 years in federal prison. No wonder Brenda had seemed increasingly desperate lately. That evening, I finally found grandfather's hidden safe behind a false panel in his bedroom closet. The combination he'd written in his journal, our family's founding date, clicked into place with satisfying precision. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather that smelled like decades of mountain air, were the real contracts. The actual 1952 surveyor agreement, legitimate lease documents from the original development, and most importantly, the 99-year land lease agreement that had quietly expired in 2020. The rough texture of authentic 1950s paper felt completely different from Brenda's modern forgery, like the difference between fine sandpaper and plastic wrap. These documents carried the weight of history, but the real revelation was in grandfather's handwritten notes, tucked between the official papers. 15 years of documented harassment, theft, and intimidation. Names, dates, amounts stolen. A meticulous record of everything the Walsh family had done to him. The most heartbreaking entry was dated just 2 months before his death. They think they've broken me, made me believe I'm just a crazy old man, but I've kept records of everything. Someday, someone will make this right. My hands shook as I read his final note. The reversion clause activates if lease payments are interrupted for more than 60 consecutive days. All improvements become property of the landowner. Since no legitimate payments had been made since 2005, every house in Pinnacle Ridge legally belonged to me. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stop digging or you'll regret it. Some secrets are better buried. I looked out at 847 homes twinkling in the darkness, then at Agent Kim's business card. Brenda had just threatened the wrong grandson. I called Janet Torres at 7 a.m. the next morning. Janet, I need you to explain something to me. What exactly is a reversion clause? Her voice was sharp and awake, despite the early hour. Where did you find that term, Cole? In my grandfather's original 1952 contract. It says all improvements revert to the landowner if lease payments are interrupted for more than 60 days. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. I could almost hear the wheels turning in her legal mind. Cole, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Are you telling me there's an active reversion clause in the original surveyor agreement? That's exactly what I'm telling you. And according to grandfather's notes, no legitimate lease payments have been made since 2005. Jesus Christ. Cole, do you understand what this means? I was starting to, but I needed to hear it from someone who'd spent decades wrestling with property law. Under Colorado revised statutes, when improvements are made on leased land and the lease terms are violated, those improvements can legally revert to the landowner. We're not just talking about the land under their houses, we're talking about the actual houses themselves. The smell of strong coffee filled my kitchen as I processed this bombshell. Outside my window, I could see the subdivision spread across the mountainside like an expensive carpet of stolen dreams. 847 homes, with an average value of $450,000 each. The math was absolutely staggering. $381 million in real estate that legally belonged to me. So you're saying I literally own their houses? I'm saying that according to Colorado law, when a property lease is systematically violated for years, all improvements constructed during that time become the property of the landowner. Your grandfather's contract specifically includes this nuclear provision. I walked out onto the porch, listening to the morning symphony of suburban life. Coffee makers gurgling to life, garage doors groaning open, Range Rovers purring as they started up for the morning commute to Denver. All of it happening on property that belonged to my family. Honestly, the irony was delicious. Brenda had spent months threatening me with fines and eviction, while literally squatting on land I owned, including her own precious McMansion. Janet, what would happen if I actually enforced this clause? Theoretically, you could evict every single family in that subdivision, immediately, without compensation. It would be the largest residential seizure in Colorado history, the nuclear option. I could obliterate Brenda's entire kingdom with one legal filing, not just her house, but every house she claimed to protect through her HOA presidency. The ultimate revenge would be rendering 847 families homeless to get back at one corrupt woman. But as I watched a yellow school bus pick up kids at the corner, children who had nothing to do with their parents' mortgage situations. I realized that wasn't the man my grandfather had raised me to be. "There's another approach," Janet continued, apparently reading the hesitation in my silence. "We could use the reversion clause as leverage, file the claim, but offer reasonable purchase terms to legitimate homeowners, force out the bad actors while protecting innocent families." The dusty scent of grandfather's old property books seemed to drift from inside the cabin as she explained precedent cases. Some property owners had used similar clauses to become overnight millionaires. Others had leveraged them to create fair, long-term community solutions. What about Brenda, specifically? She's been living in that house since 2018, long after the lease violations began. Under the reversion clause, she has zero legal claim to the property. We could have her evicted within 30 days and seize everything she's built her fake empire on. I sat in grandfather's weathered rocking chair, feeling the weight of absolute power. The choice between maximum revenge and maximum justice was literally in my hands. But something about the timeline still bothered me. "Janet, if this reversion clause has been active since 2005, why didn't my grandfather use it?" Intimidation, most likely. Elderly landowners often get overwhelmed by legal complexity, especially when facing organized opposition. He probably died never knowing the full extent of his rights. That's when I understood what had to happen next. This nuclear option was about to reshape everything. The next morning, I filed the paperwork that would change everything. Janet Torres walked the quiet title action through Denver District Court, while I sat in my truck outside the courthouse, watching normal people live normal lives that were about to get very complicated. The legal document claimed ownership of all improvements on my 1,300 acres, giving every resident 30 days to prove their right to remain. Within hours, my phone started ringing nonstop. "Mr. Brennan, this is Patricia Sterling from Channel 7 News. We understand you filed a massive property claim against the Pinnacle Ridge subdivision. Would you like to comment?" I declined the interview, but the cat was out of the bag. By evening, news vans were parked along the mountain road, and my quiet inheritance had become the lead story on Denver's evening news. The smell of diesel exhaust mixed with pine needles as reporters set up their equipment. I watched from my cabin window, knowing this media attention was exactly what I needed for the next phase of my plan. That evening, I started making house calls. Not to Brenda's allies, they could sweat for a while. Instead, I visited the families who'd been victimized by her schemes. Margaret Flynn was first on my list. "Cole, honey, come in," she said, ushering me into her cozy living room that smelled like homemade cookies and lavender. "I heard about the legal filing. The whole neighborhood's in an uproar." "Margaret, I want you to know something. This isn't about hurting innocent people. I'm offering legitimate purchase options to families like yours. Fair market value for your lot with 10-year payment plans at low interest." The relief in her eyes was immediate. "You mean we can stay?" "Not only can you stay, but you'll finally own your land free and clear. No more HOA fees, no more Brenda's fake security charges, no more Dennis manipulating your property taxes." I spent the weekend visiting 43 families, explaining the same offer. The sound of grateful tears and relieved laughter followed me from house to house. These people had been living under Brenda's thumb for years, paying illegal fees and enduring constant harassment. Meanwhile, I was installing more than just security cameras around the property. Buck Martinez had introduced me to his nephew, Tony, a former Army communications specialist who now ran a private security company. The whir of drill motors filled the mountain air as we mounted high-definition cameras at every access point to the subdivision. "These aren't just recording devices," Tony explained, adjusting a camera near the main gate. "They're streaming live to a secure server with facial recognition software. Anyone who enters or leaves this property gets logged automatically." But the real trap was more subtle than surveillance equipment. I'd learned something important during my research: one-party consent recording laws in Colorado. As long as one person in a conversation knows it's being recorded, it's completely legal. I started carrying a small digital recorder everywhere, capturing every interaction with Brenda and her allies. The rough plastic casing felt like insurance in my pocket. Sarah Sterling, the local newspaper editor I'd met through Mrs. Opal, had become an invaluable ally. She'd been investigating Brenda's schemes for months, collecting testimonies from local businesses that had been extorted. "Cole, I've got statements from 12 business owners, she told me over coffee at the local diner. Hardware stores, restaurants, even the post office. Brenda's been running protection rackets throughout the entire county. The aroma of fresh coffee mixed with the excitement in Sarah's voice as she laid out her investigation files. This wasn't just about my family's stolen land anymore. We were documenting a criminal enterprise that had been bleeding this community dry for years. "What's your publication timeline?" I asked. "I'm holding the story until you're ready. When you spring whatever trap you're building, I want to be there with cameras rolling." Here's something most people don't know about property ownership research. Every document is public record, available to anyone willing to spend time at the county clerk's office. I spent entire afternoons teaching concerned homeowners how to trace their own property histories, showing them how Dennis Walsh had manipulated their assessments. "Look at this," I explained to Robert Kim, a software engineer who lived 3 streets over. "Your house was assessed at $320,000 in 2019, but Dennis lowered it to $180,000 the next year. That's not market fluctuation. That's systematic fraud designed to reduce county tax revenue. The technique is simple. Request property assessment records by address, compare year-over-year values, and look for dramatic decreases that don't match market trends. When you find patterns of manipulation, you've got evidence of corruption." But my favorite part of the plan was the bait I'd been dangling. Through Margaret Flynn, I'd started spreading rumors that I was desperate for a quick settlement and overwhelmed by the legal complexity. I even had her mention that I was considering selling everything to a Denver developer who'd tear down the subdivision and build condos. The texture of grandfather's old fishing line felt familiar in my hands as I set this particular hook. Within days, Brenda started making calls to schedule a private negotiation to resolve our unfortunate misunderstanding. She thought she was about to prey on another overwhelmed family member. Instead, she was walking into the most comprehensive legal trap I could design. All I needed now was the perfect venue for her final performance, with witnesses, media, and law enforcement present to watch her empire crumble in real time. The community center would work perfectly. Brenda took the bait faster than I expected. 3 days after word spread about my desperation, she showed up at my door with a completely different energy. Gone was the imperious HOA president with her clipboard of violations. This woman looked like she hadn't slept in weeks, her usually perfect makeup slightly smudged around the edges. "Mr. Brennan, I believe we got off on the wrong foot," she said, her fake British accent wavering like a bad radio signal. "Perhaps we could discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement." I invited her onto the porch, making sure my hidden recorder was running. The morning air carried the scent of pine sap and her increasingly desperate perfume, something that probably cost more per ounce than my monthly groceries. "What did you have in mind?" "Well, I've spoken with some investors in Denver. They're prepared to offer you $500,000 for a quick resolution to this unfortunate legal confusion." $500,000 for property worth $381 million. The audacity was breathtaking, even for Brenda. "That's generous," I said carefully, "but I'll need time to consider all my options." Her relief was almost pathetic to witness. Of course. Just remember, legal battles can be expensive and unpredictable. Sometimes it's better to take a sure thing. After she left, I immediately called Agent Sarah Kim to report the attempted bribery. But Brenda's desperation was just getting started. That night, I was jolted awake by the sound of splintering wood and diesel engines. Through my security cameras, I watched a crew of 3 men with jackhammers attempting to damage my cabin's foundation, trying to make it look like a legitimate utility emergency at 2 a.m. The sound of breaking concrete echoed through the valley as they worked to undermine my home's structural integrity. But here's the mini twist that made everything perfect. One of the workers answered his cell phone during the covert operation. "Yeah, Mrs. Walsh, we're working on it now." His voice carried clearly through the mountain air. "Should look like a gas line leak caused the damage. Insurance will cover the demolition, and then you can claim the whole property's uninhabitable. Insurance fraud, attempted destruction of property, and criminal conspiracy, all captured in high-definition video with timestamps and GPS coordinates. But when I tried to call 911, I discovered Brenda's most dangerous escalation yet. My phone had no service, neither did my landline. Someone had cut the communication cables running to my property, isolating me completely from outside help, while the accident was being staged. For the first time since this whole thing started, I felt genuinely afraid. Brenda wasn't just playing legal games anymore. She was willing to physically harm me to protect her empire. I had to rely on my emergency radio to contact Buck Martinez, who called the sheriff's department from town. By the time deputies arrived, the sabotage crew had vanished, leaving behind only tire tracks and damaged foundation concrete. The next morning brought more bad news for Brenda's operation, though. Dennis Walsh got fired from the county assessor's office after the internal investigation revealed 12 years of systematic fraud. The sound of his county-issued truck being repossessed echoed through the subdivision as neighbors watched from their windows. But that's when Brenda made her most desperate and dangerous move. She started a whispering campaign, claiming I was mentally unstable and potentially violent. According to Margaret Flynn, Brenda was telling people I'd threatened to burn down the entire subdivision and was stockpiling weapons in my cabin. These weren't just neighborhood gossip anymore. These were the kinds of lies that could get me killed if the wrong person believed them. Her Facebook posts became increasingly unhinged, sharing heavily edited photos that made my security cameras look like sniper positions, and my legitimate property maintenance look like preparing for war. "This dangerous individual is planning to destroy our community," read one post. "We need to protect our families before it's too late." The problem was that some people were starting to believe her. I noticed certain neighbors avoiding eye contact, crossing the street when they saw me coming. Parents pulled their children inside when I drove past. Brenda was turning me from sympathetic property owner into community threat. But her biggest mistake was targeting Buck Martinez's hardware store with sudden emergency building code violations after he publicly supported my legal position. When longtime community members saw her weaponizing county bureaucracy against a 30-year local business owner, the tide of public opinion finally shifted. "That woman's gone too far," I overheard one neighbor tell another. "Buck Martinez is the most honest man in this town." The smell of autumn leaves and approaching winter carried a sense of finality through the mountain air. Brenda had escalated beyond legal maneuvering into actual criminal behavior, and she was running out of allies fast. But I could feel her preparing one last desperate gambit that would either save her empire or destroy everything she'd built. Time to force that final confrontation before someone got seriously hurt. The breaking point came when they arrested Brenda at Denver International Airport. Agent Sarah Kim called me at 6 a.m. with the news. "Mr. Brennan, your Mrs. Walsh was caught trying to board a flight to Costa Rica with a suitcase containing $847,000 in cash from various HOA accounts." The sound of my coffee mug hitting the kitchen counter echoed through the cabin. 847,000? Interesting number, isn't it? Almost exactly $1,000 per house in the subdivision. Looks like she was planning to disappear with every penny of treasury funds she could grab. Brenda's final mini-twist was that she'd been systematically draining HOA accounts for months, knowing her empire was about to collapse. While residents paid their monthly fees, she was literally stealing their money to fund her escape plan. But getting arrested while fleeing the country had triggered something much bigger than local fraud charges. "The IRS is now involved," Agent Kim continued. "Turns out Mrs. Walsh has been claiming those stolen lease payments as tax deductions for property management expenses on her federal returns. We're looking at tax evasion, money laundering, and wire fraud charges spanning multiple states." By noon, news vans were lined up along the mountain road like metallic vultures. The story of an HOA president stealing millions and getting caught fleeing to Costa Rica was cable news gold. But the real drama was happening inside the subdivision itself. With Brenda in federal custody, her remaining allies began turning on each other faster than reality TV contestants. Dennis Walsh, desperate to save himself, started cooperating with investigators and revealing the full scope of their operation. Margaret Flynn called me around 2 p.m. with updates from her neighborhood network. "Cole, honey, you won't believe what's happening. 3 more HOA board members just resigned, and someone spray-painted thief on the Martins' garage door." The Martins had been Brenda's most vocal supporters, claiming I was trying to destroy property values and demanding the county seize my land through eminent domain. Now that the FBI had revealed the extent of Brenda's theft, anyone associated with her was facing community backlash. "There's something else," Margaret continued. "A bunch of us are organizing a residents' coalition. We want to formally support your settlement offer and ask you to help us create a legitimate HOA board." This was exactly what I'd been hoping for. That evening, I called a town hall meeting at the community center for the following week. The smell of fresh-cut lumber filled the air as Buck Martinez and his crew set up additional seating to accommodate the crowd we were expecting. Sarah Sterling, the newspaper editor, had been saving her investigation for this moment. "Cole, I'm ready to publish everything. 15 years of financial records, testimony from 37 victims, documented evidence of corruption at every level." The rough texture of her manila folders felt like justice under my fingertips as she showed me the scope of her reporting. This wasn't just about my family's stolen land anymore. It was about exposing an entire network of corruption that had been bleeding the community dry. My headline is "The Mountain Mafia: How One HOA Stole Millions," she said with obvious satisfaction. "It goes live the morning of your town hall meeting." But the most important development was something I hadn't expected. Families throughout the subdivision started approaching me directly with settlement requests, not because they had to, but because they wanted to be part of building something better. "Mr. Brennan, we've been living under that woman's thumb for 5 years, said Jennifer Walsh, no relation to Dennis, a single mother who lived near the subdivision entrance. "The idea of owning our land free and clear, no more HOA fees, no more arbitrary fines, it sounds like freedom." The sound of genuine gratitude in her voice reminded me why I was fighting this battle. These weren't enemies. They were neighbors who'd been victimized by the same corruption that killed my grandfather. By the end of the week, I'd received formal purchase requests from 673 of the 847 households. At $50,000 per lot, with 10-year payment plans at 3% interest, families would actually pay less monthly than they'd been paying in combined mortgage, HOA fees, and illegal security charges. The financial analyst I'd hired to structure the deals was amazed. "Cole, you're basically giving these people a 40% discount on market rate, while still generating enough revenue to fund community improvements and conservation projects." That's when I realized what my grandfather would have wanted. He'd bought this land because he believed in community, in families having a place to call home. Destroying that community to punish one corrupt woman would have betrayed everything he stood for. The aroma of pine needles and wood smoke from early fireplaces carried a sense of anticipation through the mountain air. Change was coming, and for the first time in months, it felt like positive change. But I knew Brenda's supporters weren't going to surrender quietly. The town hall meeting would be their last chance to fight back, and desperate people often made the most dangerous enemies. I spent the weekend reviewing my security footage, making sure every camera angle was perfect for what I knew would be Brenda's final performance. Because even from her federal holding cell, she was still trying to control the narrative. Time to give her an audience for the grand finale. The community center had never seen a crowd like this. 300 people packed into a space designed for half that number, with standing room only along the walls, and overflow seating spilling onto the front lawn. Local news crews had set up cameras in every corner, and I could smell the metallic scent of electronic equipment mixing with the nervous energy of an entire community. Sheriff Martinez, the honest one, not Brenda's brother-in-law, stood near the back with 2 deputies, keeping watch over what everyone expected to be a contentious meeting. I'd spent the morning reviewing my presentation with Janet Torres, making sure every legal detail was bulletproof. The PowerPoint slides on my laptop contained 15 years of documented evidence, financial records, and security footage that would finally tell the complete truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, stepping up to the microphone that squealed with feedback before settling into clarity. 3 weeks ago, I inherited my grandfather's property. What I discovered changed everything we thought we knew about this community. The room fell silent, except for the whisper of recording equipment and the rustle of winter jackets as people leaned forward. Let me start with some numbers. For 15 years, a property management company has been collecting an average of $450 per month from each household in Pinnacle Ridge. That's over $12,000 monthly that should have been coming to my family as legitimate lease payments. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people did quick mental math. But here's what makes it worse. While my grandfather died believing our family had lost everything, certain individuals were living like royalty off stolen money. I clicked to the first slide, showing Brenda's Range Rover, designer clothes, and expensive vacations. all funded by theft. That's when the back doors burst open. Brenda herself walked in, flanked by what looked like a team of expensive lawyers. She'd somehow made bail and decided to make one final stand. Her perfectly styled hair and fresh makeup couldn't hide the desperation in her eyes as she marched toward the front of the room. "This man is lying," she shouted, her fake British accent gone completely. "I demand the right to respond to these slanderous accusations." The crowd erupted in angry voices, some supporting her, most calling for her to shut up and sit down. Sheriff Martinez moved closer to the front, hand resting on his radio. "Mrs. Walsh," I said calmly, "you're welcome to stay and hear the evidence, but this isn't a debate, it's a presentation of facts." I clicked to the next slide. Security footage of Brenda shredding documents in her garage at 2 a.m., time-stamped and crystal clear. Fact 1, destruction of evidence. Click. Fact 2, document forgery. The image showed her fake 1955 agreement next to the real contracts from grandfather's safe. Fact 3, attempted bribery. I played the audio recording of her offering me $500,000 to resolve this misunderstanding. With each piece of evidence, Brenda's face grew paler. Her lawyers were frantically whispering among themselves, clearly realizing their client had walked into a trap. But I wasn't done yet. Now, here's the part everyone needs to understand about property ownership and lease agreements. I clicked to a slide showing the 1952 reversion clause. When lease payments are systematically stolen for years, Colorado law allows the property owner to reclaim all improvements. The room went dead silent as people processed what this meant. Every house in this subdivision was built on land belonging to my family. Since no legitimate lease payments have been made since 2005, I legally own every building, every driveway, every fence post in Pinnacle Ridge. Someone in the back shouted, "You can't just steal our homes." "You're absolutely right," I replied, "which is why I'm not going to. Instead, I'm offering every family the chance to purchase their lot at fair market value, $50,000 with 10-year payment plans at 3% interest." Relief swept through the room like a physical wave. But first, let me announce the immediate changes to your lease agreements. Effective today, monthly payments increase from $450 to $1,350 per household. The crowd erupted in outrage until I raised my hand for silence. That's market rate for prime mountain real estate. However, any family that signs a purchase agreement within 30 days will pay the reduced rate of $850 monthly until they complete their purchase. Now the math was working in everyone's favor. Most families would actually pay less than they'd been paying in combined mortgage, HOA fees, and Brenda's illegal charges. But Brenda wasn't finished. She stood up, shaking with rage, and screamed, "This is extortion. I built this community. I protected these property values. This man is destroying everything." That's when Agent Sarah Kim stepped forward from the crowd. "Mrs. Kensington Walsh, you're under arrest for federal wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion." The click of handcuffs echoed through the suddenly silent room. "You can't arrest me. I'm a pillar of this community. I know people in Denver. My lawyer will have your badge." Her meltdown was spectacular and heartbreaking at the same time. This woman, who'd terrorized an entire community for years, was reduced to screaming threats while being led away in handcuffs. The applause started slowly, with Margaret Flynn clapping from the front row. Then Buck Martinez joined in, followed by Jennifer Walsh and her neighbors. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet, cheering as Brenda was escorted outside. Through the windows, we could see news cameras capturing every moment as she was placed in the back of an FBI vehicle. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said as the applause died down, "this was never about revenge. It was about justice and building a real community where families can afford to live and thrive." Sarah Sterling stepped up to the microphone next. "The Mountain Chronicle will be publishing the complete investigation tomorrow, documenting 15 years of fraud and corruption. But today marks the beginning of something better." As people filed out of the community center, shaking hands and making plans for their new future, I felt something I hadn't experienced since grandfather died: peace. 6 months later, Pinnacle Ridge looked like a completely different place. The artificial perfection of Brenda's HOA dictatorship had been replaced by something more genuine: families working together to build the community they actually wanted to live in. The sound of children playing in yards without fear of violation notices filled the mountain air, mixed with the aroma of backyard barbecues and genuine neighborhood conversations. Brenda received an 18-month federal sentence and was ordered to pay $2.3 million in restitution. The judge called her crimes a systematic betrayal of community trust that destroyed lives and families. Dennis got 6 months and permanent banishment from any government position. But their punishment wasn't the most satisfying part of this story. 847 families had successfully signed purchase agreements for their lots. The Democratic HOA board they elected reduced fees by 60%, while actually improving services. Turns out you can accomplish a lot when you're not funding someone's Range Rover payments. I used the settlement money to establish the Ezra Brennan Memorial Scholarship, providing college funding for local high school students who demonstrate community service. 23 kids received awards this year, including Jennifer Walsh's daughter, who's studying environmental engineering. The conservation project exceeded my wildest expectations. 400 acres of pristine mountain wilderness became a permanent nature preserve, complete with hiking trails, wildlife observation areas, and educational programs for visiting school groups. The smell of untouched forest and the sound of elk returning to their ancestral grazing grounds would have made grandfather proud. My own life changed in ways I never expected. Sarah Sterling and I started dating after she insisted I couldn't fix her car because of journalistic integrity conflicts. Her investigation won a state press award and led to corruption investigations in 3 other Colorado counties. I opened Brennan's Honest Auto Repair in town, with Buck Martinez as my landlord and biggest supporter. Word spread quickly that you could trust me not to invent problems or overcharge for simple fixes. Apparently, basic honesty was revolutionary in the auto repair business. The annual Pinnacle Ridge Freedom Day became our biggest community celebration, marking the end of HOA corruption and the beginning of genuine self-governance. This year's festival featured live music, local food vendors, and a dunking booth where people could pay to dunk actors dressed like corrupt HOA presidents. Even the kids loved the symbolism. The sound of laughter echoed across the mountain meadows as families enjoyed their first summer of actual freedom. Property values increased 15% once word spread about our reasonable fees and honest governance. Turns out people want to live in communities that aren't run by criminals. I kept one reminder of the whole ordeal: grandfather's original 1952 Surveyor compass, displayed on my kitchen table next to his final journal entry. "Someday, someone will make this right," he'd written. Every morning, I read those words and remembered that justice sometimes takes decades, but it's always worth the fight. 3 weeks ago, I received an email that made my blood run cold. A family in Texas facing an identical HOA fraud scheme, complete with stolen lease payments and forged documents. The pattern was unmistakable. Another Brenda, operating in another community, destroying another group of families. I forwarded their information to Agent Kim and started researching property law in Texas, because some fights are too important to ignore, and some communities deserve the chance to build something better. The mountain air carries possibility these days, along with the scent of pine needles and the promise of snow. Change is coming to more places than just Pinnacle Ridge, and corrupt HOAs everywhere should be very, very worried.
Thanks for hanging out with us on HOA Stories, where the HOA Karens meet their match. If this story had you cheering or cringing, go ahead and like the video, drop a comment with your reaction, and hit subscribe so you're ready for the next wild HOA tale.